Good morning, everyone. Thanks
Good
to those
morning.
who are joining us here. Hello. We'll give everyone a minute to get in the Zoom and get their audio connected. Thanks to many of you for being so prompt on this Friday morning. Nice to see some familiar faces and familiar names, as well as some new ones. So we'll give it just a minute here and then we'll get started. Right. Well, good morning. Thanks for joining One Neighborhood Builders for our monthly Fresh Fridays series. I'm Grace Evans-Pedanu from One Neighborhood Builders. We're gonna kick off the conversation here with just a few housekeeping notes. So if you would like to turn on captions for this webinar, you can do so. So my colleague Allie will be showing on the screen here some instructions. First, you click captions on the bottom of your screen. If you don't see captions, you can click the more or the three little dots and then select captions from there. You can choose your caption language and then click show captions, and that should in real time create some captions here for your participation today. So we launched this Fresh Fridays series to create a space for practitioners, community members, policymakers, and other folks who are interested in learning and sharing about community development, especially topics that are really deeply intertwined with the work of community development, like which we will consider today, which is really talking about land use. So today we're going to talk about land conservation and housing, with the goal of hopefully demonstrating that these two things have more in common than you might think. We're excited to have 4 practitioners from across Rhode Island who are experienced leaders in these spaces and serving on our panel today. So we'll do introductions in just a few minutes. But before we get started, just a couple quick notes. First is that we will be recording this session, as we intend to share it with those who are not able to join us but may be interested in the topic. Second, if you have any questions or comments while one of our panelists is speaking, please feel free to leave it in the chat within the Zoom platform, and we'll try to incorporate it into the conversation. And towards the end of the session, we'll also have an open Q&A, during which you can come off mute and ask questions, and we'll also be able to return to some of those that were asked in the chat that we didn't get to quite yet. Third, I just want to remind you that if you hear a phrase or an acronym or something that you're not familiar with, we'd encourage you to ask about it in the chat. So my colleague Allie will be watching and be able to jump in to explain as she's able, and oftentimes others who are participating might jump in and explain as well, and we really encourage that. This is a space for learning, so please feel free to use it as such. Fourth and finally, just so other folks have a sense of who's in the room here, if you don't mind, take a moment in the chat, share your name, where you're here from, why you're interested, anything, so that other folks who are here today can get a sense of who might be listening in as well. Okay, now let's get to the fun stuff. So today we're going to hear from 4 fabulous panelists who I'm going to name here, and then as they engage in the conversation, they can introduce themselves a little bit further. So first we have Kate Sayles, who is the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Land Trust Council. We also have Kevin Essington, who is the founder of City Greener Strategies and is also a board member at One Neighborhood Builders. Third, we have Matt Tracy, who is the Land Access Manager for the Southside Community Land Trust here in Providence. And fourth, we have Christian Belden, the Executive Director of Church Community Housing Corporation in Newport. So thank you all for being here today. As we dive into the discussion, I wanted to provide some just very basic grounding for the context of this discussion. So I think we just want to acknowledge that there's several variations on the narrative that many of us have heard, which is that we can't prioritize both housing and land conservation, and that the resources we have, money, space, et cetera, are so scarce that we can't both preserve open space, parks, et cetera, and also build housing. While there are certainly trade-offs and prioritization that we have to do in these spaces, we hope to really use today to explore some opportunities, strategies, tools for greater collaboration between the housing and conservation space, ultimately towards the goal of creating more beautiful, dense, livable, and affordable communities while also preserving open space and critical environmental areas. So to start us off in the conversation, I'm going to ask Kate Sayles, the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Land Trust Council, to chime in first. So Kate, for those who are new to land conservation, can you just talk a little bit about what is a land trust, why are they important, and what does it look like in Rhode Island?
Sure, Grace, no problem. A land trust is a community-based organization that works with willing landowners to conserve and protect important open spaces, forest land, farms, and natural areas in the public's benefit. We prioritize how we do our conservation work based on different conservation priorities. So whether we're talking about water quality or recreation for the public, we're thinking about climate change resiliency, we're trying to figure out the best way to work with willing landowners to do conservation work. We have more than 50 land trusts in the state of Rhode Island, more than our municipalities. We have 18 municipal land trusts, and the remainder are 501c3 nonprofit land trusts. The difference between a municipal land trust and a 501c3 nonprofit land trust is that a municipal land trust is sort of an advisory board to a city or town, where a 501c3 can hold land and do acquisition projects sort of on their own. The Land Trust Council is the statewide coalition of all of our land trusts, and we serve several purposes. First and foremost, we sort of act as the advocacy arm for all of our land trusts. Our land trusts are mostly all volunteer organizations, and so we are able to sort of work to speak in one voice up at the State House and make sure we are working on good land conservation policy, as well as encouraging our state legislator to be involved and interested in the work that we do. We also make sure that all of our land trusts have what they need to be successful. So with land conservation comes the legal requirements of monitoring and stewarding all of the lands that we protect. We make sure that all of our land trusts have what they need to succeed. And we also work on public engagement activities. So that's sort of what we do in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Kate. And really talking about this sort of conservation land trust model. And now I'm going to ask Christian from Church Community Housing Corporation to chime in, who have experience in both conservation land trusts, but also in community land trusts, which I'll be asking you to describe a little bit here. So Christian, can you just talk about Church's work in Newport and Aquidneck Island and explain how you all have leveraged the community land trust model and maybe some examples of what that looks like?
Sure. So for those who aren't familiar with Church Community Housing, we're the oldest community development corporation in the state, established in 1969. We have been developing housing of all sorts since then. We have a homeless shelter, we have an assisted living development, we have HUD 202s for the disabled, HUD 811s for HUD 202s for the elderly, HUD 811s for seniors. We have about 600 units of housing in our portfolio right now. We're currently constructing 54. We'll start constructing another 54 in 2 months from now. So we'll be at 700 at that point. And then we have 107 lots in our land bank. And our land bank is what we use to create affordable home ownership opportunities for mostly moderate income families, people earning between 60 and 80% of area median income. And so if you buy a home from us, we sell you just the home and we retain ownership of the land. We provide you with a ground lease, a 99-year ground lease for $30 a month. And so this is the main factor in making home ownership affordable for moderate income families in the Newport County area. That's largely where we operate. So, removing the cost of the land from the homeownership equation means that we're selling, new construction, net zero, single family homes for like $270,000 right now. And so that, is really a program where we're turning renters into homeowners. It's a workforce housing model. And it's really, one of the best models that we work with. In addition to that, as you mentioned, we do have experience with conservation land trusts. We did an art and agriculture development in Tiverton called Sandy Woods Farm. We sold 90 acres of the original 190 acres to the Tiverton Land Trust. They created the Basket Swamp Preserve there. We're right now trying to acquire nearly 15 acres of land in Portsmouth, and the Portsmouth Land Trust, we've been in, or the Aquidneck Island Land Trust, we've been in conversation with them about selling a portion of it for preservation as conservation land. And so, we were sort of driven to this model for two reasons. One is that we often find that we have higher development costs because of higher land values in Newport County, as well as in some instances, higher labor and material costs on the construction side. And so, we realized that we needed to engage in partnerships to try to, acquire land more cost effectively, or to just give us an opportunity to acquire land, because it often takes 2 years for us to get permitting in place and then get funding approvals to allow us to close on an acquisition. And so if we enter into a partnership with a municipality, for example, who buys a piece of property for us first, and then we can enter a purchase and sales agreement with them, they can act as the friendly, patient seller while we get our funding and permitting approvals before we can pay them for the land. And that, so we have had good relationships with most of the land trusts we've worked with. In one instance in Jamestown, the town of Jamestown purchased a nearly 7-acre parcel from a family that church community had actually worked with. They had been running a 501c3 nonprofit. We acted as a development consultant. And through that relationship, they approached us and said, "Oh, we want to sell our property and would like to do something good with it." And so with a partnership with the municipality, the town bought the land and then proceeded to apply for conservation funding through, I think, DEM. And we sat down and they were like, "Well, how much land should we preserve? How much land will you need to develop?" And, we wanted to conserve as much as possible. So we said, well, we think you can conserve 5.5 of the 6.9 acres and we'll be able to do what we need to do on the remaining 1.3 acres. And that turned out to be a mistake, because when we proposed the 2 additional single family homes on the remaining 1.3 acres, the Connecticut Island Land Trust came out in opposition to us, screaming that the density was outrageous because it was in an RR 200 zone, just ignoring the fact that in reality, we were proposing a total of 3 single family homes. One was already there on nearly 7 acres of land. So they sort of use this technicality as an argument for a high level of density. Ultimately, the planning board approved our comprehensive permit. We were sued. It took us, I think, 14 months to have the Superior Court, decide in our favor. And we're pulling building permits next week to build those 2 net zero single family homes, which, we think are going to be amazing products, because they will front on 5.5 acres of conservation land in Jamestown, and they'll create, important rare homeownership opportunities for moderate income families in Jamestown.
Thank you so much, Christian. And I appreciate you both sort of setting the stage for some examples of how what it really looks like for housing work and conservation work to intersect, as well as previewing for us some of the places where tension arises, where there are challenges. And I'm certain we'll get into that a little bit more as we move forward and with some of the Q&A. I want to introduce our third panelist now, Kevin Essington. So Kevin, you've worked in land conservation, in parks and in public lands works, both in Rhode Island and in Massachusetts. You are also a member of the board of One Neighborhood Builders, which means you must care about housing a little bit too, right? So hoping that you could talk a little bit about this question of balancing different land uses and how that's showed up in the different hats that you've worn over the course of your career.
Thank you. I won't go into the whole career previously, but I will talk about a couple examples. I appreciate Christian's stories from Jamestown as a contemporary example of the tension between open space or conservation and housing. And I just want to point out that this is not a new tension. I like to call out the example of the creation of the urban parks movement, which was in the mid to late 19th century. So say starting from the creation of Central Park and places like the Emerald Necklace in Boston and going through to the end of that century. And in established cities like those of us here on the East Coast, it created tensions. Many of you may know that people were displaced in the creation of Central Park, for example. And even here in Providence, where I'm living and working, the donation of land to create what is now Roger Williams Park was at the time a bit controversial in that the city was not so sure they even wanted a park or a parks department. And when you get down to what goes on at the neighborhood level, it is simply because many people, the demands of housing and of daily living, especially for working class people, and back in the 19th century, these are folks working in brutal conditions, but by day and living in brutal conditions by night. There were very real needs that needed to be met, and that thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, things like trees and grass and clean water seemed to many, when they have so many other needs, to be secondary. We know now, of course, through some terrific work that's gone on in the last 10 to 20 years about the medical value of nature, whether it's clean air and clean water, which the Romans knew about that, certainly. But even just being in nature and the benefits to people's mental health and to quality of life has been medically documented. And so there are a lot of allies, but yet the tension remains. And a couple of examples from my experience working at the Trust for Public Land up in Boston for about 9 years, creating smaller quarter-acre new public open spaces in Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, provided some examples of some of those tensions. I remember working in the Codman Square area and working with the Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corporation, our peer group, One Neighborhood Builders. They were great partners, but yet when we were proposing converting a vacant lot that was not used by anybody for any legal purposes, to convert it to a public space next to a new commuter rail stop on the Fairmount line, it created some pushback from the neighbors who said, why are we doing this park when we're getting priced out of our neighborhood that our grandparents grew up in? And we listened and asked them to come in and talk with us about some things that they need in the neighborhood, in addition to an affordable place to live. And then we got into what it's like to live there with the speed racing that was going down the side street, with the dangerous walk that they had to take small children to the closest playground. And through those dialogues, we learned what they needed, and we were able to design a public space that met their needs, and working with the city of Boston, recontour the street to cut down on dangerous driving. And we had examples of that as well in Mattapan, working with Dudley Street Neighbors Initiative, another famous CDC, on creating urban farms. Again, a lot of the same conversations, but often when these green spaces are created and start to be used and start to build community, they become beloved quite quickly. And by doing something that's temporary, that is not a permanent installation that people feel is forced on them, that they can play with a little bit and try to adapt to, that seemed to be one technique that was successful for us in moving forward in navigating that tension between open space, parks, and housing. So that's it for now for me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And you've sort of teed up Matt quite well here. So we're going to go to our fourth and final panelist, Matt Tracy, from the Southside Community Land Trust in Providence. So Matt, can you tell us just a little bit about the Southside Community Land Trust, and then share a little bit about your experience of this intersection with housing and conservation?
Hi. I just wanted to note that I think I heard the word tension come out quite a bit from the last two speakers, and Kate may have also referenced that word. And I wanted to introduce myself by saying tension is my middle name. So I've been working at this sort of intersection of land use and various municipalities and their policies and their planning for a long time, not on the high level, but as a sort of a land user, a producer of things, and an implementer of conservation practices. And at Southside, the organization is focused on bringing nutrition and stability and sustainability to communities by fostering, community gardening, by fostering new businesses in our communities, and by fostering and training new farmers through our land access programs. So we own and manage land. We also use land. Southside Community Land Trust has around 30 land projects going at any given time. Many just long-standing community gardens that have been run by neighborhood residents for 40 plus years. Other projects are quite new. We're doing work in neighborhoods in Pawtucket and Central Falls, community gardening, urban farming, youth programs on those sites. We own and or manage larger parcels in Cranston. Those are purely agricultural production incubator farms where new farmers coming mostly from urban communities, from refugee immigrant communities, from the African-American community are coming out onto our properties to start small farm enterprises. Those projects are booming right now, and I spend a lot of my time on those. And what my role has been to take those projects and move them in a more sustainable direction by bringing in existing federal funds that can help us to grow our infrastructure, but also help us to improve our ecological footprint, improve water quality, improve for lack of a better word, design of these properties, to sort of rethink them for the next 100 years or the next 20 years. I shouldn't say 100, that's ambitious. And tie them better to communities, and also sort of infill back into Providence. Like we have this funny dichotomy now. I feel like the city mouse, country mouse dichotomy reminds me a lot of the sort of, farmer or open space versus housing dichotomy. So we're right within our network, we're trying to knit things together, and we're trying to be an example for others. So I hope I summed up my work. And when I mentioned the tension piece of it, that goes back to when I was an independent farmer, and my partner and I were purely trying to run an urban farm, which grew through some success into a peri-urban farm, And at every step of the way, we really did have to tango with developers and landowners who always had an opinion about how the land should be used, why it shouldn't be in farming, why farming and food production is a thing of the past and the future is something else. They never really had a clear idea of what that something else was, but it wasn't going to be farming, because I think people's idea about food. Oh, am I sorry? The people's ideas about growing food and land conservation are that we're trying to do something static. There was a farm here and it needs to stay the way it was. And there's this idea that there's no innovation, there's no change that can happen, there's no integration that can happen between our housing needs. And because many of the folks I work with, the farmers, they're housing insecure as well. They're food insecure as well. They're challenged by all this stuff, just like the average everyday person is. So the idea that a farm would just be the same old thing that it was, a dairy or a pumpkin patch, is wildly unrealistic. And I think part of my job and the folks I work with is getting people to see that change is happening and it should be encouraged, because our projects, our programs and projects like them can be like a really great part of any housing project, whether it's urban, peri-urban, or rural.
Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate you we've seen a few different corners, I think, of really what it looks like for housing and conservation to work together. I'm glad that you brought up farming. That was something that I think is really important for us to touch on. I'm going to try for one more question that takes us just maybe one step back up into the big picture, and then we're going to open it up to the to folks who are here on the call. So get your questions ready. So in a recent poll that was conducted by the Nature Conservancy of Rhode Island, 83% of Rhode Islanders agreed that with the right planning, we can protect Rhode Island's forests, open space, and build more affordable housing without having to choose between the two. So it's clear that there is a interest and support for this idea of finding solutions that allow us to achieve both of these goals. So I'm going to ask, this is sort of particularly for Kate and Kevin, but everyone should be welcome to, from the panel, should be welcome to chime in. Kate first, perhaps. Could you talk a little bit about some efforts that are underway here in Rhode Island to think about how we might resource this kind of work? And then, Kevin, if there are examples that you might share from other places as well, would be interested to hear them.
Yeah. So first, I just think, we keep talking about tensions, and those tensions are real. And I think that it's so much easier to think about what our differences are than what our similarities are, and try to figure out how to work together and meet in the middle, just as a whole. I feel like if we baseline all of this with just the understanding that we all believe that Rhode Islanders deserve a safe, healthy, affordable place to live with access to clean air, clean water, outdoor recreation, and local healthy food, like if we start from that point and we try to figure out ways where we can work together past the tensions, we're in a way better place. So I can talk a little bit about the piece of legislation I'm working on. So in 1990, we passed this law. It's a law that creates the Rhode Island Housing and Conservation Trust Fund. It's modeled after the Vermont law that's been in effect since 1987. What it does is create a board of both affordable housing, tenant advocacy, and developers, and land conservation, land trust, farmers, and land use planners to work together on trying to figure out how to do affordable housing, land conservation, and prioritize projects that do both things. And it also comes with a pot of funding. The pot exists, but it's never been funded. The board exists in state law, but it's never been appointed. What we're trying to do right now, the Land Trust Council, Nature Conservancy, Audubon, and a lot of other housing organizations are trying to build out the board to make sure that it better reflects Rhode Island's diversity, as well as additional board members that represent farther into affordable housing and farther into land conservation. So we're going from a 9-member board to a 15-member board, and we're trying to get appointments. That's what we're trying to do. We're not seeking funding this year because we don't have time to continue to work in silos. This is an opportunity for us to have a formalized structure where we can start trying to prioritize individual projects. I just want to speak to what happened in Vermont. So in 1987, they did the same exact thing. We almost adopted word for word the law in Rhode Island. They've been able to, since then, create 15,000 affordable homes, conserve 500,000 acres, including 800 farms, and do redevelopment and historic preservation on 80 buildings that are being used in communities across Vermont. Now we're 30-something years behind, but this is the first opportunity we will have, hopefully, to be able to do this in a formalized way. We don't need to wait for the General Assembly. It's really important to start conversations like the one we're having today. It's really important to get to know each other. Again, we're not always going to agree, but if we set a platform where we have the opportunity to try to figure out some of this stuff together, and we're not working in silos, we're in a better position. And land use is so broad, right? We're not just talking about the intersection of housing and land conservation. We're also talking about all of the other things we need to be sustainable, to think through climate change, transportation, other land uses. We need to make sure we're thinking about them together and not continuing to work in separate little pots. I think that's it.
Thank you, Kate. And Kevin, do you want to briefly mention the Community Preservation Act in Massachusetts?
I will, and it's a crime to try to do it briefly. It could be a whole Fresh Friday in itself, and perhaps that's something we can do in a year from now or something like that. But the Community Preservation Act is what year is it? It's a 24-year-old statute that has, as Kate described in Vermont, has created thousands of affordable homes and conserved hundreds of thousands of acres of all kinds of lands, as well as restored hundreds of historic properties. Its function, in brief, is that there is a state funding source that is that the revenue comes from deed recording fees. When you go to refinance or sell your property, you pay a fee at your town or county clerk. I think it's county clerk in Massachusetts, and that goes into a pot that serves as a match. And then individual municipalities can then vote to opt into this program and create their own program, both in terms of how it's funded on their end through a property tax surcharge that they could set within a range of fairly modest range, but one that's secured enough that you can even bond against as a community. And then you create your own local community preservation commission as part of your municipal government that then manages the funds, comes up with a plan, and assigns the resources to meet the needs of your community. That could be for recreation, housing, soil preservation, or a blend of all three. So it's been very successful in Massachusetts. It's very popular where it has been enacted. I don't think it's ever been revoked in the history of the program in any municipalities, which is a terrific sign. And as we explore ways to blend funds here in Rhode Island to get more projects done, it's something for us to consider.
Thank you. I appreciate that sort of speed explanation. And to your point, I think any one of the topics that we have touched on just a teeny bit today probably deserves a whole day of its own. So acknowledging that, we're going to go to open Q&A now, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Allie Steinberg, who will be facilitating the Q&A session.
Thanks so much, Grace. So yeah, I'm seeing a robust discussion in the chat, and so I want to make sure I get to some of those questions. So in terms of to David's question about the church community land trust, church community housing does operate as a community land trust through those ground leases that Christian mentioned. Christian, is that correct? That it does operate as a community land trust?
That's correct.
Awesome. Great. And then I want to get to Tina's question. Tina, you're raising your hand. Do you want to talk about your question?
Yes. Good morning, everybody. We know where I'm going with this. We think, everything that you're doing is fantastic, but we're not thinking about accessibility. We need to go beyond universal design because we're building apartments that people think they're following the ADA or they're thinking they're doing right by us, which is great. The problem is that it's not functional for us because they're not including us in the conversation. I mean, we just built 16 units in East Providence, 62 are going, and none of them are properly wheelchair accessible for somebody like me that are useful. We don't only need the housing, we need the land around it. When FEMA has 55% of Rhode Islanders registered as a mobility aid user, we all know that Rhode Islanders hate to register. So we know those are the most important. So we know that that number is way higher than it is with the baby boomers all hitting, 65 and older in the next few years. We need to be thinking when we're doing this, accessibility in the land, in our beaches, in our housing. If you build a wheelchair accessible home, we all could live in it. But if you don't, we can't live in it at all. And we need to think about it that way. A home doesn't need to look like a hospital just because it's accessible. I mean, if you come and see my home, it's very warm and cozy. You wouldn't even know it was accessible if you didn't know I was in a wheelchair. This is what we need to be building. This is what we need to be thinking about. And we need to be part of the conversation in order to do it right. I praise everybody for trying, but the ones that are going up right now are not functional for us.
Thank you so much, Tina. I think that you're raising really important topics, obviously, and that we need to be incorporating real accessibility into when we're talking about tensions. We need to make sure we're also talking about accessibility and actually moving them forward. And I see Matt dropped something in the chat that USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and RCS funds accessibility projects for farm and forestry projects. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to elaborate. That's a very key funder for any land projects. Like if you're trying to do a hybrid housing and land preservation project to work with NRCS on things like accessibility it can be slow. It can involve a lot of design, but in the end, there is money for accessible trails, accessible access to open spaces, accessible systems for growing food and livestock. So it's a pretty interesting resource when you work with a land user that has access to things like that.
And I'll be sure to share out some links based on that afterwards. So if folks are interested in learning more about funding available. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate you raising that. So I see next that Dominic raised a question about solar farms. I'll read your question, Dominic. If you have anything else you want to add afterward, you can feel free to come off mute and just say that. So it appears that solar panel farms are new competitors for open space. How do you view the potential green benefit of solar-based electricity versus gobbling up lots of open space? Anyone want to chime in on
I'd be
solar
happy
farms?
to.
Oh,
Sure.
go for it, Kate.
So yeah, we've had a lot of permanent conversion of forest land to solar in the last 10 years. Specifically in the last 10 years, I think we've had over 2,000 acres converted. And right, there's an intersection there too. We worked last year with several other conservation organizations and came to sort of an understanding with solar developers on the need to try to move our projects away from our core forests and onto previously developed sites. We have a lot of parking lots, we've got rooftops, and there are development opportunities for things that have been converted already. It's not a perfect piece of legislation. It directs incentives to previously disturbed sites, but we need to be doing a good job with siting. I will say that I feel like it's not an apples to apples comparison with forests and solar. People always want to talk about carbon, right? So forests store and sequester carbon, and solar panels have lots and lots of benefits, but forest provides a lot of benefits and solar panels are pretty one-dimensional. Forests clean our air, they clean our water, they provide habitat for wildlife, they give us a sense of place. They provide wood products to our people who work in the woods, and we use them as well. So it's kind of nuanced. I feel like there's another bill, the renewable ready program, that would incentivize development on previously disturbed spaces, that's up at the State House right now. I'm not sure where that's going, but I feel like it's moving along. So hopefully in tandem, that'll encourage solar development in places that aren't green spaces. But we need both things, right? Like, it's the intersection. We need renewable energy as well as transportation, housing, and land conservation. It's a land use planning exercise, I would say.
Yeah, I would just add the other thing that I've seen. I live in Western Rhode Island, and in some places where they put these solar panel farms, they've clear cut prior growth areas, and it's sad to see that happen. It makes them appear more like a parking lot, and you lose all the trees and the growth and all the animal life that's there. And I'm not saying that I don't appreciate the benefit of solar electricity, but it is another one of these tensions where
It is.
you got different uses, and
It's a tension in the conservation community too, Dominic, because we don't have the capacity to be able to do conservation work on all those parcels when we're competing with that level of development. It's not the same. We don't have access to the same funding, and that's just the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. So unfortunately,
Yeah, raising some good questions about the future of different uses beyond kind of the ones we've dealt with since the 1870s, like Kevin was talking about. Claudia asked, this maybe is a question for you, Kate. Do you know how the Vermont Housing and Conservation Program was funded?
I believe there's a transfer tax, and I haven't looked in a while. I don't know what that transfer tax is. I think it's changed over the last 30 years. We have a lot of potential to fund different examples from across New England and across the country for how to fund the Conservation and Housing Trust, which is why I feel like we need to come together to discuss it instead of try to move forward with the transfer tax. That might make it dead on arrival at the State House in the current budget year. So we have time to think through that. And Vermont certainly is the example. CPA is the other example. There's an opportunity to bring that to Rhode Island as well, perhaps next legislative session.
Can I make one last comment before we wrap up here? I noticed Matthew Tracy made this comment about solar and really all these land uses, planning is key. And, I think I actually didn't close the loop. I said that there were two motivations driving us to our interactions with land trusts, and I really just talked about the financial and logistical one. The other is that we care. We don't just care about housing. We have been aggressively pursuing the most energy efficient and sustainable construction methods for decades now. Every single family home we have in construction right now is net zero, with the 54 unit senior affordable housing development under construction will be passive house when it's done. We have remote net metering credit agreement where we offset all of the electrical consumption for every apartment that we own with renewable energy credits, and we receive a 30% discount. So that's a win-win. And the same can be true about land conservation and housing development. We need both housing and we need a healthy environment. And there's no reason that the tension is really just a lack of focus on the benefits. I have a background in urban planning, and some of the places with the highest land values in the country are places like Central Park and the Boston Common, where you have open space adjacent to housing and other uses. That public-private partnership and the adjacency of all of the benefits that you get from open space to housing creates additional benefits that, just the tax revenue that then the municipality can use to support other social benefits. I think, not being fanatical is the key. Understanding that, you can have both is, and that we aren't, we're multidimensional creatures that, can support more than one thing, I think is just important.
Yeah, thanks so much, Christian, for showing how you're already doing it and also how we know that people need multiple things. And so we're not gonna, we can possess both and we don't have to choose. So what a robust discussion. So I think we can see that there are some questions we didn't get to, and recognizing that we're at 9:30, I'm gonna try to take all the questions that we didn't get to in the chat and send out some email answers in a follow-up, as well as any links that were shared in the chat. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to our panelists for facilitating such a robust discussion. And thank you all for joining us this morning. We hope that you'll join us at a future Fresh Friday. We'll be announcing our June discussion that will be on June 14th. And please note as you exit the Zoom meeting this morning, a brief survey regarding today's event will pop up in the browser on your device. It'll ask you for feedback on today's session. So please take a minute or two to respond. It'll help us continue to provide engaging and helpful experiences at Fresh Fridays in the future. So we hope you have a great rest of your Friday, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Nice to